In June of 1942, in a small apartment in Tomsk, Western Siberia, a woman named Mariya Oktyabrskaya opened an envelope that carried the signature of a Red Army officer she had never met. She was 40 years old, short, solidly built, with dark hair pulled back tight and eyes that people remembered as careful. The letter was 8 lines, typed on thin military paper, and it told her that her husband, Senior Politruk Ilya Oktyabrskaya, had been killed 2 months earlier near Kiev, fighting the German advance. Mariya read the letter twice, standing in the kitchen, and she did not cry. She folded the paper once, put it on the table, and sat down. Her hands were steady, her breathing was even, but something inside her had locked into place, a decision forming in the silence. She had been married to Ilya for 15 years, no children, and every one of those years had been built around service, discipline, and a shared belief that the Soviet Union was worth defending. Ilya had been a political officer, the man who reminded soldiers why they fought, and he had believed every word he spoke. She stood up after 10 minutes, picked up the letter again, and made a plan. This is how a factory worker with no military training bought her own tank, drove it into combat, and became one of the deadliest soldiers on the Eastern Front. Mariya had worked in a cannery before the war, sorting fish and sealing tins, but when the invasion began in 1941, the factory retooled to produce munitions. She moved to the assembly line for artillery shells, 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week, and every ruble she earned went into a savings account she shared with Ilya. They lived simply, no luxuries, no debts, and by the time the letter arrived, she had accumulated nearly 50,000 rubles. It was enough to live on for years, or it was enough to do something else. In July, 2 weeks after the letter, she went to the local branch of the state bank and withdrew the entire balance in cash. The clerk asked if she was certain. She said yes, and the transaction took less than 5 minutes. She carried the money home in a cloth bag, counted it once on the kitchen table, then wrote a letter of her own. The letter was addressed to the Defense Committee in Moscow, and it had 3 parts. A declaration that she wished to donate 50,000 rubles to the Red Army Tank Fund, a request that the money be used to build a T-34 medium tank, and a condition that she be allowed to name the tank and drive it herself. She mailed the letter the same afternoon, then went back to work at the factory and said nothing to anyone. She did not know if the request would be approved or even acknowledged, but she knew what she wanted. Ilya was gone, the Germans were advancing deeper into Soviet territory every day, and sitting in Tomsk while others fought felt like surrender. She was not a soldier, had never fired a weapon in anger, but she understood machinery. She could learn what she needed to learn, and she had enough anger to carry her through. For 3 months, Mariya heard nothing from Moscow, and she began to assume the letter had been ignored or lost. She kept working at the factory, kept her head down, and thought about alternate plans. But in late September, a telegram arrived. It was short, formal, and signed by someone in the People's Commissariat of Defense. The telegram said her donation had been accepted, construction of the tank had begun at the Ural tank factory in Nizhny Tagil, and her request to crew the vehicle herself was under consideration pending an interview and evaluation. Mariya read the telegram twice, then folded it and put it in the same drawer where she kept Ilya's death notice. She had expected rejection or silence, but now she had a door, and she intended to walk through it. The next day, she went to the factory supervisor and requested leave. The supervisor asked why. She told him the truth, and he stared at her for 10 seconds before signing the paperwork. 2 days later, she boarded a train east toward Nizhny Tagil, carrying 1 small bag and a copy of the telegram. The train took 36 hours, stopping at every depot along the line to pick up evacuees and factory workers being reassigned. Mariya sat in a crowded compartment near the back, said little, and spent the time thinking through what she would say when she arrived. She had no illusions about the difficulty of what she was asking. Women were not allowed in tank crews, had never been allowed, and the exceptions so far had been limited to pilots and snipers. But the rules had already bent in a dozen places since the war began, and Mariya had a card most people did not. She had paid for the tank herself, and that gave her leverage. The Ural tank factory in Nizhny Tagil was the largest armoured vehicle plant in the Soviet Union, running 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, turning out T-34s faster than the Germans could destroy them. Mariya arrived in the morning, presented the telegram at the main gate, and was escorted to an office inside the assembly complex. The office belonged to a man named Kurokov, an engineer and deputy director, and he greeted her with cautious politeness. Kurokov was in his 50s, grey-haired, with oil stains on his sleeves and a bluntness that Mariya appreciated. He confirmed that her donation had been logged, that a T-34 was being assembled with her funds, and that the tank would carry the name she had requested, Fighting Girlfriend, painted in white letters on the turret. Then he explained the problem. The Red Army had no provision for civilians to serve in combat roles, even civilians who paid for their own equipment, and the request to let her drive the tank had been kicked up 3 levels of command without a clear answer. Mariya asked what it would take to get a clear answer. Kurokov said she would need to prove she could do the job, and that meant training. If she could pass the same qualifications as any other tank driver, and if she could convince the officers in charge that she would not be a liability, then maybe the request would go through. But the training was brutal, the standards were high, and most recruits washed out in the first 2 weeks. He asked if she understood what she was volunteering for. Mariya said yes, she understood, and she asked where to start. Kurokov studied her for a moment, then made a phone call. The call was to a tank training school 40 kilometers south of Nizhny Tagil, a facility that took raw conscripts and turned them into crews in 6 weeks. He spoke briefly, hung up, and told Mariya to report there the next morning. She thanked him, left the office, and spent the night in a workers' dormitory near the factory, lying on a narrow bunk and thinking about Ilya, and about what happened next. The training school was a collection of barracks and sheds on flat, muddy ground, surrounded by ranges and obstacle courses where tanks rolled from dawn to dusk. Mariya arrived before sunrise, reported to the duty officer, and was assigned to a barracks with 30 male recruits, most of them younger than 20. The officer read her paperwork, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, and Mariya dropped her bag on an empty bunk and fell in line with the others. The first day was physical conditioning, running, lifting, climbing, designed to weed out anyone who could not handle the strain. Mariya was older and slower than the recruits, but she finished every drill, ignored the stares, and kept her face blank. The second day was mechanical instruction, learning the T-34 inside and out, the engine, the transmission, the suspension, the fuel system, and the weak points that could kill you if you made a mistake. Mariya had worked with machines her entire adult life, and she absorbed the lessons faster than most of the class. On the third day, the recruits climbed inside a tank for the first time. Mariya was assigned to the driver's seat, a cramped, dark space under the front armor, with a narrow vision slit and a set of levers that controlled the clutch, the gears, and the steering brakes. The instructor was a sergeant named Ryabov, a tanker who had survived 8 months at the front and lost most of his patience in the process. He told the class that driving a T-34 was like wrestling a bear that wanted to throw you off a cliff, and that anyone who did not respect the machine would end up dead or crippled. Mariya gripped the controls, listened to the engine roar to life behind her, and felt the whole vehicle shudder under her hands. Ryabov gave orders. She pulled the levers, and the tank lurched forward, grinding across the training field. The steering was stiff, the gears fought her, and the noise was overwhelming. But she kept the tank moving in a straight line, then executed a turn, then a reverse, and then Ryabov told her to stop. He leaned down through the hatch, looked at her, and said again. For 2 weeks, Mariya spent every daylight hour in the driver's seat, learning to handle the tank on flat ground, on slopes, through mud over obstacles, and in formation with other vehicles. The T-34 weighed 26 tons, could move at 50 kilometers per hour on a good road, and had a turning radius that required every ounce of strength she could muster. Her shoulders ached, her hands blistered, and every night she collapsed on her bunk too tired to eat, but she did not miss a single drill. The other recruits stopped staring after the first week. Most of them had washed out or been reassigned, and the ones who remained were too focused on their own survival to care about hers. Ryabov, the instructor, pushed her as hard as anyone else, maybe harder, and he never offered encouragement, but he stopped checking her work after the 10th day, and that was enough. Mariya knew she was meeting the standard, and that was all she needed. The first official test came on a cold morning in late October, 3 weeks into the course. The test was a timed run through an obstacle course, navigate a series of ditches, hills, and barriers, then hit 3 targets with the tank's machine gun, all in under 15 minutes. Failure meant reassignment to a support unit. Success meant moving to the next phase. Mariya climbed into the driver's seat, waited for the signal, and gunned the engine. The tank shot forward. She steered hard left around the first barrier, downshifted into a ditch, and felt the suspension bottom out as the tracks clawed for grip. She pulled back on the right brake, swung the tank through a tight turn, and accelerated up a steep incline, the engine screaming under the load. At the top, she braked, let the gunner line up on the first target, and heard the machine gun chatter. The target fell. She moved to the next position, repeated the drill twice more, and crossed the finish line with 40 seconds to spare. Ryabov stood at the edge of the course, stopwatch in hand, and he nodded once. Mariya climbed out of the hatch, mud on her boots and sweat on her face, and Ryabov told her she had passed. He also told her that passing the course was not the same as being approved for combat, and that her case was still being reviewed by officers who had never met her and might never approve. But she had done her part, and now it was out of her hands. In early November, Mariya was called back to Nizhny Tagil for a meeting with a senior officer from the main armoured directorate. The officer's name was Colonel Volkov, a man in his 40s with combat decorations and a reputation for results. Mariya was told to bring her training records, report to the factory office, and be prepared to defend her request in person. She arrived at the appointed time, walked into the office, and found Volkov sitting behind a desk with her file open in front of him. He did not invite her to sit, and he opened the conversation with a blunt question. Why did she think she had the right to demand a combat assignment when thousands of men were waiting for tanks? Mariya met his eyes and said she was not demanding anything. She had paid for the tank, completed the training, and was offering her skills in the only way that made sense. If the army preferred to give fighting girlfriend to someone else, she would accept that, but she would not stop trying until she got an answer. Volkov listened, flipped through the file, and asked about her motivation. Mariya told him about Ilya, about the letter, and about the fact that sitting in the rear while others died felt like cowardice. She did not ask for sympathy, and she did not frame it as revenge, though that was part of it. She framed it as service, the same principle Ilya had believed in, and the same principle that had kept the Soviet Union standing for the past 16 months. Volkov closed the file, leaned back, and was silent for nearly a minute. Then he said the decision was not his alone, but that he would recommend approval on one condition, that she serve as a driver under an experienced crew, take orders like any other soldier, and accept reassignment if she proved to be a liability. Mariya agreed without hesitation, and Volkov picked up a phone and made a call. The call lasted 5 minutes, and when he hung up, he told her that fighting girlfriend would be assigned to the 26th Guards Tank Brigade, currently refitting near Smolensk, and that she would report for duty in 2 weeks. Mariya thanked him, saluted, and left the office. She walked back to the dormitory, sat on her bunk, and for the first time since Ilya's letter had arrived, she allowed herself to believe that this might actually work. The 26th Guards Tank Brigade was a frontline unit that had been pulled back from the fighting around Smolensk to absorb replacements and repair damaged vehicles. Mariya arrived in late November, travelling by military transport with a convoy of new tanks, including Fighting Girlfriend, freshly painted, the name in bold white letters just below the turret. She was met by the brigade commander, a major named Petrov, who looked at her, looked at the tank, and asked if she was serious. Mariya said she was serious, handed him her orders, and waited. Petrov read the orders twice, shook his head, and assigned her to a crew led by a sergeant named Krasnov, a veteran who had been fighting since the first week of the war. Krasnov was 32, wary, and had a scar across his forehead from a shell fragment that had nearly killed him outside Minsk. He was also, as it turned out, skeptical about the idea of a 40-year-old woman driving his tank. Krasnov made his skepticism clear the first time they met. He told Mariya that the front was not a training ground, that mistakes got people killed, and that if she could not keep up, he would request her removal. Mariya said she understood, and that she expected nothing less. Krasnov studied her for a moment, then told her to get inside the tank and show him what she could do. They spent the rest of the day running drills, moving across open ground, navigating through a forest, and practicing quick stops and turns that put stress on every part of the machine. Krasnov barked orders from the commander's cupola. The gunner and loader worked through firing sequences, and Mariya pushed the T-34 hard, harder than she had pushed it in training, because she knew this was the real test. At the end of the day, Krasnov climbed out of the hatch, walked around to the front of the tank, and told her she would do. On December 2nd, 1942, the 26th Guards Tank Brigade moved out toward the front line, part of a larger offensive aimed at pushing the Germans back from the approaches to Moscow. Fighting Girlfriend was in the second wave, Krasnov commanding, Mariya driving, and 2 other crewmen handling the gun and the ammunition. The mission was to support an infantry assault on a fortified German position, suppress enemy fire, and hold the ground until reinforcements arrived. They rolled out before dawn, 20 tanks in a loose column, moving through frozen fields and sparse forest. Mariya kept her eyes on the tank ahead, followed the route exactly, and tried to ignore the fact that this was real, that in less than an hour, people would be shooting at her. The engine was loud, the cold seeped through the hull, and the vision slit gave her a narrow, jerky view of the world outside. Krasnov's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and steady, calling out bearings and distances. The first German fire came from a tree line 200 meters ahead, machine guns and anti-tank rifles, the bullets pinging off the armor like hail on a tin roof. Krasnov ordered the gunner to engage, the main gun boomed, and a cloud of dirt and splinters erupted from the tree line. Mariya accelerated, angling the tank to present the thickest armor, and closed the distance. More fire came in, heavier now, and she felt a sharp jolt as something hit the front glacis plate and ricocheted away. They reached the tree line, crushed through the undergrowth, and the gunner raked the German positions with machine gun fire. Krasnov called out a new target, a bunker 50 meters to the left, and Mariya swung the tank around, planted the tracks, and gave the gunner a stable platform. The main gun fired again, the bunker collapsed, and Krasnov ordered them forward. They moved through the German line, infantry running behind them, and for the next 2 hours, Mariya drove, stopped, turned, and drove again, following Krasnov's commands and keeping the tank in the fight. By midday, the German position had been overrun, and the brigade pulled back to regroup. Fighting Girlfriend had taken 6 hits, none of them penetrating, and Mariya had burns on her hands from the controls and a splitting headache from the noise. Krasnov climbed out of the hatch, inspected the damage, and declared the tank fit for another sortie. He also told Mariya that she had done well, which was the closest thing to praise he had offered so far. The second sortie came that afternoon, another push forward, this time against a German counterattack. The Germans had brought up reinforcements, including Panzer IVs, and the fight turned brutal. Mariya watched through the vision slit as 2 Soviet tanks brewed up, hit by anti-tank guns, and she had to steer around the wrecks to keep moving. Krasnov's voice was tense now, calling out threats faster than the gunner could engage them, and Mariya felt the tank shudder as another round hit the turret and glanced off. They knocked out 1 German tank, then another, but the third one got them. The shot came from the right, punched through the side armor, and exploded inside the turret. Mariya felt the blast wave slam her forward, heard Krasnov scream, and smelled burning metal and flesh. The intercom went dead, smoke filled the crew compartment, and she knew without looking that Krasnov and the gunner were dead or dying. The loader, a kid named Petya, was yelling something she could not hear, and Mariya made a decision. She reversed the tank hard, pulled back 50 meters, and slammed the brakes. She climbed out of the driver's seat, crawled back into the turret, and found Krasnov slumped over the gun, half his chest gone. The gunner was unconscious, bleeding from the head, and Petya was trying to drag him toward the hatch. Mariya grabbed the gunner's legs, and together they hauled him out of the tank and onto the ground. By then, Soviet infantry had moved up, medics appeared, and Mariya collapsed beside the tank, shaking and unable to speak. Krasnov died that night in a field hospital. The gunner survived but was sent to the rear, and Mariya spent 3 days in the same hospital being treated for burns and smoke inhalation. The doctors wanted to evacuate her. She refused, and on the 4th day, she walked out of the tent and reported back to the brigade. Major Petrov told her that Fighting Girlfriend was being repaired, that a new crew was being assigned, and that she could stay on as the driver if she wanted. She said she wanted. The new commander was a lieutenant named Belov, younger than Krasnov, less experienced, but eager to prove himself. He treated Mariya with a mix of respect and caution, and he made it clear that he had heard about what happened to Krasnov, and that he did not intend to repeat the mistake. Mariya asked what mistake he meant, and Belov said Krasnov had been too aggressive, had pushed too far forward, and had paid the price. Mariya did not argue, but she thought Belov was wrong. Krasnov had done what needed to be done, and if the cost was high, that was the nature of the fight. The tank was ready by mid-December, the damage patched, and the crew ran shakedown drills for 2 days before returning to the line. Mariya settled back into the driver's seat, adjusted the controls, and felt the now familiar weight of the machine around her. She thought about Krasnov every time she pulled the clutch, every time she heard the intercom crackle, but she did not let it slow her down. Ilya was still dead. The Germans were still advancing, and Fighting Girlfriend was still the weapon she had bought to do something about it. In January of 1943, the war began to shift. The Germans had been stopped at Stalingrad, and the Red Army launched a series of offensives aimed at retaking territory lost in the first year of fighting. The 26th Guards Tank Brigade was part of the drive toward Smolensk, and Fighting Girlfriend was in the thick of it, rolling through snow-covered fields, smashing through German defensive lines, and supporting infantry attacks that pushed the enemy back kilometre by kilometre. Mariya drove the tank through conditions that would have stopped most vehicles: deep snow, frozen rivers, and mud that sucked at the tracks like quicksand. The T-34 was built for this. Wide tracks distributed the weight. The diesel engine ran in temperatures that killed gasoline engines, and the sloped armour deflected shots that would have gutted a lighter tank. Mariya learned to read the terrain, to anticipate where the tank would bog down and where it could push through, and Belov learned to trust her judgment. They fought through January and into February, and Mariya began to lose track of the individual battles. They blurred together into a continuous cycle of movement, contact, fire, and withdrawal. She saw tanks burn, saw infantry cut down by machine gun fire, and saw villages reduced to ash, and none of it surprised her anymore. This was the war Ilya had been fighting when he died, and she understood now why he had not written much about the details. There were no words for it that did not sound either trivial or grotesque. In late February, the brigade was pulled back for a week of rest and refit, the first break Mariya had seen in 3 months. She used the time to write letters, not to anyone in particular, but to Ilya, a habit she had started after the first battle and continued ever since. She told him about the tank, about Krasnov, about the fights they had won and the ones they had barely survived. She did not mail the letters, she burned them after writing them. But the act of writing helped her think, and thinking helped her stay focused. In March, the Germans counterattacked, and the brigade found itself fighting a defensive battle near a town called Vitebsk. The Germans had brought up fresh units, including Tiger tanks, and the fight turned into a grinding, brutal exchange of fire that lasted 3 days. Fighting Girlfriend was hit twice, once on the turret and once on the track. But the crew patched the damage and kept fighting. Mariya drove the tank into positions that exposed them to fire, held steady while the gunner engaged targets, and then pulled back before the Germans could zero in. On the 2nd day, Belov was wounded. A shell fragment caught him in the shoulder, and he passed command to the gunner, a corporal named Dmitri, before being evacuated. Dmitri was 24, a factory worker from Leningrad, and he had never commanded a tank before. He asked Mariya what they should do, and she told him to keep fighting, the same as before. Dmitri nodded, took Belov's place in the cupola, and they went back into the line. The 3rd day was the worst. The Germans launched a coordinated assault, tanks and infantry moving together, and the Soviet line began to buckle. Fighting Girlfriend was positioned on the left flank. supporting a battalion of infantry that was taking heavy casualties, and Dmitri ordered Mariya to move forward, close the gap, and buy time for the infantry to withdraw. Mariya knew it was a bad position, exposed and unsupported, but she also knew Dmitri was right. If they did not hold, the whole line would collapse. She drove the tank into the gap, swung the hull to face the German advance, and Dmitri started calling targets. The main gun fired, reloaded, fired again, and the Germans kept coming. Mariya felt rounds hitting the tank, heard the armor ring like a bell, and prayed that nothing would penetrate. The loader, a kid named Ivan, was moving like a machine, slamming shells into the breach faster than she had ever seen. And Dmitri was calling corrections with a calmness that did not match the chaos outside. They held for 20 minutes, knocked out 3 German tanks and scattered the infantry, and then the Soviet line stabilized, reinforcements moved up, and Dmitri ordered a withdrawal. Mariya reversed the tank, pulled back 200 meters, and stopped behind a ridgeline. She climbed out of the driver's seat, her hands shaking, and saw that the tank was covered in impact marks, dozens of them, and that 2 of the road wheels had been shot off. They had survived by centimeters, and she knew it. In April, after the battle at Vitebsk, Mariya was summoned to brigade headquarters and told that she had been recommended for a decoration. The recommendation had come from Dmitri, who had written a report describing her actions during the defensive fight, and Major Petrov had endorsed it. Mariya did not know what to say. She had not been fighting for medals, but Petrov told her that recognition mattered, not for her sake, but for the sake of everyone else who needed to see that courage came in unexpected forms. The decoration was the Order of the Patriotic War, 2nd class, and it was presented at a small ceremony in front of the brigade. Mariya stood at attention, received the medal, and listened to a citation that described her as a model of Soviet determination and sacrifice. She did not feel like a model. She felt like someone who had survived by luck and stubbornness, but she accepted the medal, thanked the officers, and went back to work. The medal changed nothing about her daily routine. She still drove the tank, still took orders from Dmitri, and still spent her evenings maintaining the vehicle and writing letters to Ilya. But it did change how the other soldiers looked at her, and she started to notice that younger crew members would ask her questions about the tank, about the fighting, and about how she kept going. She answered the questions honestly, told them that fear was normal, that exhaustion was normal, and that the only way to keep going was to focus on the next task and ignore everything else. In May of 1943, nearly a year after Mariya had received the letter about Ilya's death, she made a decision that would define the rest of her time at the front. The brigade had been assigned to a new offensive, part of a larger operation to break through the German lines near Smolensk, and Mariya was given the option to transfer to a training unit in the rear. She had served longer than most tankers survived. She had earned her decoration, and no one would have questioned her decision to step back. She thought about it for one night, lying on her bunk in the crew quarters, and she thought about Ilya, about Krasnov, and about the hundreds of soldiers she had seen die in the past 6 months. She thought about what it meant to stop fighting while the war was still going, and she realized that stopping now would make everything she had done feel incomplete. She had started this because Ilya was dead and the Germans had killed him, and that fact had not changed. She told Major Petrov the next morning that she would stay. Petrov nodded, did not try to argue, and told her that the offensive would begin in 2 weeks. Mariya went back to fighting girlfriend, climbed inside, and sat in the driver's seat for a long time, her hands on the controls, the tank silent around her. She knew that the odds of surviving another offensive were thin, that most crews did not make it through more than a few major engagements, and that eventually luck ran out. But she also knew that this was the choice that made sense, the choice Ilya would have understood, and the choice that let her sleep at night. The offensive began on a clear morning in late May, and fighting girlfriend was in the first wave, part of a massed armoured assault aimed at breaking through the German defences in a single, overwhelming push. Mariya drove the tank through a barrage of Soviet artillery fire that had been pounding the German positions for 3 hours, and the ground ahead was torn up, cratered, and littered with debris. She kept the tank moving, followed the lead vehicle, and tried not to think about what was coming. The German line erupted with fire as the tanks closed, anti-tank guns, mortars, and machine guns opening up all at once. Mariya saw the lead tank get hit, saw it swerve and stop, and she steered around it without slowing. Dmitri was calling targets, the main gun was firing, and the loader was working faster than seemed humanly possible. The tank shook with each shot, the engine roared, and Mariya's world shrank to the narrow view through the vision slit and the feel of the controls in her hands. They punched through the first line, crushed wire obstacles, and rolled into the German trench system. Mariya drove over bunkers, flattened gun positions, and followed Dmitri's orders to turn, stop, and fire. They knocked out 2 anti-tank guns, scattered a company of infantry, and reached the second line before running into a Tiger tank that had been dug in and camouflaged. The Tiger fired first. The shot hit fighting girlfriend on the turret, and the world exploded. Mariya was slammed forward. Her head hit the vision block, and she tasted blood. The intercom was dead. Smoke was pouring into the crew compartment, and she could hear someone screaming. She pulled the hatch release, kicked it open, and crawled out onto the deck, her ears ringing and her vision blurred. She rolled off the tank, hit the ground hard, and saw Dmitri stumble out of the commander's hatch, his face blackened and his arm hanging limp. The loader did not come out. The battle continued around them, but Mariya and Dmitri were out of it. Soviet infantry moved past, medics appeared, and someone dragged Mariya away from the burning tank. She tried to tell them about the loader, tried to go back, but her legs would not hold her, and she collapsed in the mud. She was loaded onto a truck, driven to a field hospital, and spent the next 3 days in and out of consciousness. When she woke up fully, a doctor told her that she had a concussion, burns on her hands and face, and shrapnel wounds in her shoulder and leg. The wounds were not life-threatening, but they would take weeks to heal, and the doctor recommended evacuation to a rear hospital. Mariya asked about Dmitri and the loader, and the doctor told her that Dmitri was alive, in another tent, and that the loader had died in the tank. His name had been Ivan, he had been 19 years old, and Mariya had not even known his last name. She was evacuated 2 days later, loaded onto a hospital train headed east, and spent the journey lying on a bunk, staring at the ceiling, and replaying the battle in her head. She thought about the moment the Tiger had fired, about whether she could have turned the tank faster, presented a different angle, and avoided the hit. She did not know, and the not knowing ate at her. She thought about Ivan, about Krasnov, about all the others, and she wondered how many more names she would collect before this was over. The train arrived at a hospital in the Urals, and Mariya spent the next 6 weeks recovering. The doctors patched her wounds, the nurses changed her dressings, and slowly, painfully, she began to heal. She asked about returning to the front, and the doctors told her it would depend on how she healed, but that most tankers with her level of injuries did not go back. Mariya said she would go back. The doctors looked at each other, and one of them said they would see. In July of 1943, Mariya was discharged from the hospital, cleared for light duty, and told to report to a replacement depot near Kursk. She had expected to be assigned to a training unit, or to a support role, but when she arrived at the depot, she was met by an officer who told her that fighting girlfriend had been repaired, that a new crew was being assembled, and that Major Petrov had requested her return as the driver. Mariya did not ask why. She simply said yes, and 2 days later, she was back with the brigade. Fighting girlfriend looked different. The turret had been replaced, the name repainted, and there were new dents and scratches that had not been there before. The crew was different too, a new commander, a new gunner, a new loader, all of them replacements who had heard about Mariya but had never met her. The commander was a lieutenant named Sokolov, mid-20s, serious and clearly uncertain about having a 41-year-old woman as his driver. Mariya shook his hand, told him she was ready to work, and Sokolov decided to judge her by results. They trained together for a week, running drills and learning each other's rhythms, and by the end of the week, Sokolov told Mariya that she was the steadiest driver he had worked with. Mariya did not respond, she just nodded, and they went back to work. The brigade was preparing for another offensive, this time as part of the push to liberate Ukraine, and the timeline was tight. They would move out in 10 days, and every crew needed to be ready. The offensive into Ukraine began in August, and Fighting Girlfriend rolled south with the brigade, part of a massive armoured thrust aimed at cutting off German forces retreating from the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. The fighting was constant, brutal, and chaotic, and Mariya drove the tank through burned-out villages, across rivers swollen with rain, and over terrain that shifted from open steppe to dense forest without warning. In early September, near a town called Cherkasy, the brigade encountered a German rearguard that included dug-in tanks, anti-tank guns, and infantry with Panzerfausts. Sokolov ordered an attack at dawn, and Fighting Girlfriend led the assault, charging across open ground while German fire poured in from 3 directions. Mariya drove straight at the German line, dodging craters and wrecks, and Sokolov called targets faster than the gunner could engage them. They knocked out 2 anti-tank guns, overran an infantry position, and were closing on a German tank when a Panzerfaust hit the side armour. The explosion was deafening, the tank lurched sideways, and Mariya felt the controls go slack. The right track had been blown off, the tank was immobilized, and Sokolov ordered an immediate evacuation. Mariya popped the hatch, climbed out, and saw German infantry moving toward them from 50 meters away. Sokolov grabbed a submachine gun, jumped off the tank, and started firing. The gunner and loader followed, and Mariya pulled her pistol, the only weapon she carried, and fired at the nearest German soldier. The shot missed, the soldier raised his rifle, and Mariya dove behind the tank as rounds cracked past her head. Soviet infantry arrived seconds later, drove the Germans back, and the crew scrambled to safety. Fighting Girlfriend was left behind, crippled, and Mariya watched from a trench as German artillery finished the job, blowing the tank apart. For the second time, Mariya lost her tank, and for the second time, she refused to quit. The brigade commander, now a colonel named Volkov, the same officer who had approved her original request, told her that she had done enough, that she could transfer to a non-combat role with honor, and that no one would blame her for stepping back. Mariya thanked him for the offer and said she wanted another tank. Volkov studied her for a long moment, then asked why. Mariya said it was not complicated. She had started this to fight, the fighting was not over, and walking away now felt like betrayal. Volkov asked who she would be betraying, and Mariya said herself, and Ilya, and everyone who had died in Fighting Girlfriend. Volkov did not argue, he just picked up a phone, made a call, and 2 weeks later, Mariya was assigned to a new T-34, no special name this time, just a hull number, and a crew that treated her like any other veteran. She drove the new tank through the fall of 1943, as the Red Army pushed deeper into Ukraine and the Germans fought a desperate, delaying action that cost both sides thousands of lives. Mariya stopped counting the battles, stopped writing letters to Ilya, and stopped thinking about anything beyond the next objective. She was a machine operator now, the tank was the machine, and the only question that mattered was whether the machine would still be running when the day ended. In late October, near a village called Korsun, Mariya's luck finally ran out. The brigade was supporting an infantry attack on a German strongpoint, and Mariya's tank was hit by a concealed anti-tank gun that punched through the side armor and detonated inside the crew compartment. Mariya was in the driver's seat, separated from the main blast by the firewall, but the explosion shattered her left leg, filled the compartment with flames, and knocked her unconscious. She woke up in a field hospital 3 days later, and a doctor told her that her leg had been amputated below the knee. The wounds were infected. The surgery had been rough, and the prognosis was uncertain. Mariya asked if she would walk again, and the doctor said maybe, with a prosthetic, but that she would never crew a tank again. Mariya closed her eyes, did not ask any more questions, and spent the next 2 weeks staring at the ceiling and trying to accept what had happened. She was evacuated to Moscow in November, transferred to a military hospital that specialized in amputations, and fitted with a basic prosthetic leg that let her walk with a cane. The process was painful, frustrating, and slow, and Mariya hated every minute of it. But she learned to walk, learned to manage the pain, and by December, she was mobile enough to be discharged. The army offered her a pension, a medal ceremony, and a quiet retirement. She accepted the pension, attended the ceremony, and then asked if there was any work she could do to support the war effort. They gave her a job at a factory in Moscow, inspecting tank components. The same kind of work she had done before the war, and she spent the next year and a half moving from station to station, checking welds, measuring tolerances, and signing off on parts that would be installed in tanks rolling toward the front. It was not combat, it was not revenge, but it was service, and that was enough. In May of 1945, the war in Europe ended. Germany surrendered, the Red Army occupied Berlin, and the factories began to slow down. Mariya kept working through the summer, and in August, after the surrender of Japan, the factory shut down most of its military production and began retooling for civilian goods. Mariya was offered a permanent position. She declined, and instead moved back to Tomsk, to the small apartment she had left 3 years earlier. She lived alone, walked with a cane, and took a job at a local school, teaching mechanical skills to young women who were entering the workforce. She did not talk much about the war, did not display her medals, and did not seek attention. A few reporters found her in 1946, wrote articles about the woman who bought her own tank, and the story became a minor piece of Soviet propaganda. Mariya tolerated the interviews, answered questions politely, and then went back to her life. She died in 1971, at the age of 69, from complications related to her wartime injuries. Her obituary ran in the local paper, a short notice that mentioned her service, her decorations, and the fact that she had donated her life savings to buy a tank. The obituary did not mention Ilya, did not mention Krasnov or Dmitry or Ivan, and did not mention the 2 years she spent driving fighting girlfriend into battle. Those details were in the records, in the archives, but they were not part of the public story. The official military records list Mariya Oktyabrskaya as a tank driver in the 26th Guards Tank Brigade, credited with participating in multiple offensive and defensive operations between December 1942 and October 1943. She was awarded the Order of the Patriotic War, 2nd class, and the Order of the Red Banner, and she was promoted to the rank of sergeant before her discharge. The records note that she was wounded twice, that she destroyed or damaged several enemy vehicles, and that she served with distinction. What the records do not capture is the decision that started everything, the choice to turn grief into action, to sell everything she owned, and to buy her way into a war that did not want her. They do not capture the training, the skepticism, the endless drills, and the moment when Sergeant Ryabov told her to go again. They do not capture Krasnov's death, or Dmitry's calm under fire, or the loader named Ivan who died before Mariya learned his last name. They do not capture the fact that Mariya drove fighting girlfriend through conditions that broke other crews, that she held positions that should have been abandoned, and that she climbed back into the tank after watching it burn, because stopping felt like surrender. The records are accurate, as far as they go, but they are not complete, because no record can capture the full weight of what it means to turn loss into service, and service into survival. Mariya Oktyabrskaya's story is not a story about revenge, though revenge was part of it. It is not a story about heroism, though she acted with courage. It is a story about a woman who looked at the worst moment of her life and decided that doing nothing was unacceptable, and that the only response that made sense was to put herself in the place where the loss had come from, and to do something about it. She did not change the course of the war. The Eastern Front was too vast, the forces too large, and her contribution too small to shift the outcome. But she changed the lives of the men who served with her, the crews who learned that courage came in forms they had not expected, and the soldiers who watched fighting girlfriend roll into battle and knew that someone, somewhere, cared enough to pay for it with everything they had. The medal came later, the recognition came later, but the decision came first, and the decision was what mattered. Mariya bought a tank because her husband was dead, and she could not live with doing nothing, and she drove that tank into combat because the alternative, sitting in safety while others died, felt like cowardice. The outcome was survival, then injury, then a long life lived quietly. But the meaning, the reason the story endures, is simpler. She asked for a job she was not allowed to do, and she got it.